This is my agronamer, and we've done an episode on this and the propagation of this particular plant. Now, what has happened is I'm looking at the plant and saying to myself, I'm getting so many shootings coming up and the pot is actually getting overcrowded. So today I'd like to talk about repotting and also how to make a decision on whether to go with a clay pot or go with a plastic pot. And so my name is Alice and I'm the Red Soil Gardener. The other day I was looking at my agronamer, which actually sits in my sitting room, and that's why I've got this lovely brass vase in it. I looked at it and I thought it's getting a bit overcrowded, because when we did the propagation, the time of the agronamers, which we did cover, is some of the stalks I actually did put horizontal and some of them I did stick. But what's happening is I'm getting shooting from every single stem that we propagated. And now it's getting a bit crowded, and I think it's time to actually go for a bigger pot. Now, basically, how do you know that it's time to repot? Now, if I look at this agronamer, apart from it being really full and lush in there, is when you water your plant and the water just goes straight down, it means that basically maybe you have a root ball in there, or it means that the roots have taken over, and so basically the water just drains through. Then you know that it's getting a bit crowded, and we will look at the root. The other thing is when you do pick up your plant, which this one doesn't have, and sometimes you get a bit of rooting, and it started here, I can see that little baby, is that the roots start actually looking out, coming through, and you'll see all this amazing roots coming through. That's when you know it's time to repot. The normal thing you do is that when you're going for a pot larger, if I was to take this and repot it in a pot that is larger, we look at 1 to 2 inches. And it also depends on the type of plant you have. If your plant does grow really quickly, then it doesn't make any sense to go for 1 inch or 2 inches larger. I would actually go for a 4-inch larger. So in that way, you're not repotting it every 3-4 months. So here we are, and I'm going to measure the diameter, because that's the plot size. This particular one is an 8-inch. Now, if I was going to take a larger pot, I would either go for a 9-inch or a 10-inch. So here is a plastic pot that I may plant this agronamer, or we call it the Chinese evergreen, in here. So this particular one is a 9-inch. So this is exactly what I would do is if I was to plant that plant here. And I do have a clay pot here, and I could actually plant my agronamer in here. And we're going to measure the size of this particular pot, and I'm just going to go for here, the diameter of the inside. So this one is actually, let's take it from there to here. This is actually a 10-inch. So we're going 2 sizes above. So now it's a tough decision to decide what you want, because from the aesthetic point of view, a lot of people do like clay pots because they look very earthy, and it really does look well when you have your plant in a clay pot. But at the same time, we have to understand what these 2 pots, is it going to benefit the plant? So what you need to do is, when you're choosing where to pot your plant, whether it's plastic or clay, it's good to know that whatever decision you're going to make will actually be beneficial to the plant. The other thing is also, you look at your lifestyle and decide, basically, do I want a plastic and a clay? Because from that point, as I talk about lifestyle, then you'd really have to understand what these 2 types of pot actually do. Now let's take this clay pot here. The thing about clay pots, it's porous, and it does, once you do put a plant in here, it does dry out very quickly. And so basically you'll need to water it more often. Because what happens is that as you have your plant here and you've watered it, through its structure, through the sides, it sends air and moisture out and also receives. But that means if it's a hot, like what we've had, a hot summer, is basically every second day or every day, you'll be basically watering that plant. So if, according to your lifestyle, that you won't be around because you're working or you're traveling, then I would actually recommend a plastic pot because it retains water. And once you do plant it in a plastic pot, you do your finger test and you'll know when it needs water. The other thing about plastic is just be careful, because we are plant lovers and we do sometimes overwater through love. But a plastic pot, if you don't do your finger test and make sure that your plant is relatively dry, is what will happen, you'll get root rot and you will lose your plant because of love. So there are factors to consider when you're making your decision whether to go for a clay or a plastic pot. So now that we have these two, I need to show you something. I love clay pots and I do have them littered around the garden, but the whole thing is, if I am to lift it, it is really heavy. If you're deciding to buy a clay pot for a plant that is much bigger than this agronema or Chinese evergreen, and let's assume you're living in an apartment and the lifts don't work on that particular day, carrying that clay pot up a few series of stairs would be very taxing. However, if you do have a plastic pot, it's much easier. So that's another factor you have to consider. I use a lot of plastic pots because they're easier and I love doing my gardening. I love to carry them and stuff. And if they fall, it's fine because they don't break. However, with a clay pot, I have broken several clay pots, and some of them I do use for my dogs as water basins. Even as I do my potting, I do use these clay pieces, and so this is what I do. I break them down into these sort of pieces, and then these ones I use them for drainage in my plastic pots or in my clay pots, just so that we have a really good drainage. Now the thing is that for clay pots, it's best to use it for plants that actually like to dry out, like succulents, for example. So even if you do plant a succulent here, because they do like to dry out, and you have this exchange of air and water, moisture from the soil in the plant as is, and evaporation, it'll actually do well in a clay pot. So I would actually recommend clay pots for succulents, and I do have some of my succulents in clay pots. Now the other thing, if you remember a few weeks ago, a month ago, we did an episode on the peace lily, and we mentioned it was such a hungry plant, and how you get to know that the plant is thirsty, it just droops. And once you do sort of water it, within a few hours the leaves are up and it's happy. Now I wouldn't put it in a clay pot, because once again you'll be watering all the time and your leaves will be drooping, because basically as it evaporates you're losing that moisture, and the peace lily, as we know, just loves to be moist but not soggy, but at the same time it is a thirsty drinker. Another thing is, like, if you do have ferns, I would rather put it in a plastic, because again, ferns like moisture. So with a clay pot, before you decide to do clay or plastic, get to know your plants and exactly what their requirements are, and then you can go for it. Now, another thing is that from the aesthetic point of view, is you could have your plastic, but what we normally do, get yourself containers. Like this is a plastic container here where my agronema is, but I've put it in a brass container, and I've done that to a lot of my other plants inside the house. I've either used ceramic pots to cover the plastic. And you could go vice versa, is that if you do have a plastic container and you've grown your plant, is you could just simply, if it's small enough, is use this container to be the outside pot if you want that earthy look. So either way, depending on which way you want to do it from the aesthetic, you could be quite flexible with that. Now again, let's get back to the pros and cons. Is in Kenya, we do have a lot of roadside nurseries, which we all support. And the other thing that they do, apart from plants, is clay pots. It's actually an African tradition. We love pots. And so they have all shapes and sizes, all different heights, and it's great to have them. But my thing is I love plastic because the number of drainage holes you get at the base. And that means even if you plant your plant, the water will seep through and you won't get it waterlogged, and also it prevents root rot. But unfortunately with clay pots is you only have one hole here. So I would actually grow my plant and do my finger test to make sure that my plant doesn't, in plastic, doesn't get overwatered. But again, as I mentioned, if I want that clay aesthetic look for my indoors, I would just get a plastic and get a big enough clay pot and have it as a display like that. So basically, I've given you the pros and cons for a plastic or a clay pot. And as I said, is that it really is up to your decision, and it also depends on the plant that you want to pot. Now, because I'd grown this agronema stroke Chinese evergreen in a plastic container, I am going to continue with that because I will do my finger test every week and make sure, because the thing about agronemas, they don't like water, too much water near their roots, but I will do my finger test and make sure that I'm watering it correctly. So as I've made my decision, I'm going to move it aside, and now I'm going to start the potting process. So I'm going to put this here. I've got some newspaper so that I don't dirty the table too much, because we're going to tip this thing over. What I did with the agronema is I did water it, so it is very moist at the moment, and I'm just going to try to tip it over so that we can take the whole plant out like that. Hopefully it should come out, and just gets really messy, and we can just pull it, the whole thing out. Just a bit more pressing. Here we go. Oops. So this is my beautiful plant. And I'm just going to open it up a bit. And if we see the roots, I mean, this is from the propagation, so we do have a good rooting structure. But as we've seen, is that the rooting is actually more or less at the top. So it is time to repot it and let the roots really go down in this big pot and spread its wings. So that is my plant. So I'm going to put it here. And this is the soil. And I'm going to use some of this soil because it was good soil. It was really organic and we put a lot of bark. I'm going to just collect it and put it back in. And then we'll mix it with some other fresh soil that I have prepared, which is a mixture of potting soil and compost and a bit of manure. So, and everything is going to be light. This was actually really good soil. It's very light and airy. And I'm going to take this and just empty it in here. Here we go. So what I'm going to do is actually just move this. I'm going to put it on the floor, and so we have enough space. And here we are with my lovely soil, and I'm going to add in the soil, which is potting soil, a bit of manure, cow manure in there. Perlite is in there, and so I'm going to fill it. Actually, I'm going to actually go here. And when I get to this height here, I'm going to add my agronemer inside. I'm not going to disturb it, but look at that. Oh, at least it has space. That's so sweet. So what I'm going to do is now fill the edges, and here we go. Here we go. I'm going to shake it a bit. And okay, good. Now what happens is that when I'm going to put some water in it, is that the soil will go a bit lower, and then tomorrow I'll just top it up with some more soil, because usually the water will pull it down. And then it'll be fine. I'm just going to clear this a bit, because it's getting really soil heavy. Here we go. At least it's slightly clear. And then I'm bringing it back, and I'm going to water it. Just very little, yeah. I am so happy that I did repot my plant. As we saw, because of the propagation we did last year, is my rooting hadn't really grown, and it was actually filling the top half and almost going into a root ball, which I don't want it to happen. But by moving it into a bigger pot, what happens is that you're giving the roots enough space to not compete against each other, but to find its own way in the pot. Now we have to remember that in a plant is the leaves and the roots are very interdependent on each other. They're sort of symbiotic, they live off each other. So in the root is where you get the water and the nutrients, and in the soil, and the job of the roots is to collect all this nutrient and water and oxygen and shoot it up to the leaves, where the leaf is already getting photosynthesis processes taking place, and it's producing the starch and the food that will make this even more lush. Now what happens is that when you get the roots taking over all the space, competing against each other, you will find that the foliage at the top actually suffers and it becomes smaller, because basically it's being strangled. So I am so happy with this potting. Now before I finish, I think one has to do, I do have a few I wanted to clean it up, and this is what I'm going to do. These are old foliage which I want to pick out and just generally clean it out, because it is starting afresh and we have to make my little baby here look pretty. And so if you have anything like this, just clean it out. And these are sort of remnants of stems, And so here we are, repotted agronema, making a new home. We're very happy for it. The roots will find space and feed the plant with all these lovely nutrients. And I've gone for a plastic pot, but some of you may decide to go for a clay, but just make sure you do your finger test all the time. And I do have a choice. I could use the clay pot as my outer pot and put this inside and still get that earthy look, which we all want with plants. So thank you so much, fellow gardeners. Thank you so much for joining us on this episode. Don't forget to like, to share, press the notification button, and most important, do subscribe and tell your friends about the Red Soil Gardener, because it always makes us happy when we get new subscribers and we get lots of lovely comments, and we try to answer you all the time. And don't forget to follow our Instagram, because we do post a lot of pictures and we do give tips. For example, we will give the pros and cons for the pots, for the clay pot and for the plastic. We'll lay it out on Instagram so that you can always remember and make an informed choice. So thank you so much and have a lovely day.